If you've been doing some personal work, maybe through journaling, therapy, reading, or even listening to this podcast, and yet still feel like there's something missing, you're not alone. Our stories were never meant to be engaged in isolation. That's why participating in a story workshop with the Allender Center can be such a powerful next step. I'm Rachael Chen, and I want to personally invite you to this unique in-person experience in Seattle, happening August 21 through 24, 2025. Over the course of 3.5 days, you'll receive live teaching from Dan Allender, Wendell Moss, and myself, and other Allender Center instructors. But what makes this workshop truly transformative is the time you'll spend in a story group, a small, intimate setting led by a trained facilitator who will walk with you as you engage a part of your story with care and courage. It's a space marked by compassion, reflection, and healing, a space where deep change becomes possible. If you're feeling called to take your story work further and to do it in community, this might be the next step you've been looking for. Learn more and register now at theallendercenter.org/workshops. We would love to have you with us.
Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachael Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
I've put words to this before, Rachael, that I didn't get through Algebra 1 twice. I failed both times. And my math ability, rather, shall we say, the nadir of my intellectual capacity, created a complication when I went and did my doctorate, because I had done no math work up until I did graduate statistics. And let's just say it was not pleasant for anyone in the universe. So research has always been one of those places where you go, I am in a foreign land. I don't speak the language. I don't know the mores, but I know it's compelling and crucial. So we've got two extraordinary, remarkable human beings who are part of the engagement of the Allender Center's work and research. So I'm going to take a moment and just give the remarkable credentials for these two stunning people. Dave C. Wang, Cliff and Joyce Penner, Chair of Formation of Emotionally Healthy Leaders, Associate Professor of Psychology and Spiritual Formation at Fuller Theological Seminary. David, it is such a delight to have you with us. I know you're both a psychologist, a pastor. You have been the editor of the Journal of Psychology and Theology. If I kept going, we would spend the majority of our time just going through your remarkable credentials. David, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here, Dan.
And isn't it true, though, just as a side, we could be spending the entire 45, 50 minutes on your remarkable credentials.
That would be a really boring 45 minutes.
Well, I mean, at one level, if all we did was just look at them, but we'll be getting into the question of, like, who are you? How did you do this kind of work? But before I do that, our own Danielle Zurinsky, who is the research and evaluation manager for the Allender Center, who's, been involved with our facilitators, our certificate program. She has a PhD from the University of Liverpool, a master's degree in health psychology from the University of Surrey. Like, do you understand, Danielle? Like, doctorates that come from that foreign country are some of the hardest to attain in the universe. It makes American PhDs look like grammar school. So
She's
again,
like, yes, I do understand. I live that reality.
Well, I can't compare. I've only had the one experience, but I do feel as though I've earned it.
oh my gosh. At least most of the people who I know, whether it's in psychology or in theology, who've done their doctorates in England, describe it as medieval torture and the process by which a level of learning that I'm not trying to compare the two systems, but does require a level of both ingenuity and independence and the capacity to endure British sadism with a certain aplomb. Again, inappropriate, but it's at least in the ballpark.
I would say with my program specifically, I've been really fortunate to work under professors that I hugely admire, whose work still inspires me to this day. So I've been uniquely gifted with a really good support team while I was in my program.
I apologize already to the British system for my inappropriate language. You're going to say, Rachael?
Dan, I'm not taking the interview from you, but before we jump in to getting more insight from these brilliant and playful colleagues of ours, I just want to name explicitly from the jump that one of the things we are most privileged by is that they are co-leading a research methodology, like researching our narrative-focused trauma care methodology, which is something we've been dreaming about for many years. And because of some of our own lack of capacity or even resistance, right, to trying to find language and clarity and structure for like, what is this work that we're doing with story work? We can talk about it, we can intuit it, but there's something really powerful about understanding the real mechanisms at play and how we fit into a larger conversation. So just as we go, want to make sure our listeners have that insight in their purview that we have been in the midst of some really good, honoring, sometimes good wrestling around like what is this methodology that we're bringing into our labor here at the Allender Center, and who are our partners, and what do we bring to the conversation? So I will turn it back to you. And I will turn it back to our colleagues.
Let's just say that again, these two human beings to me are both precious. Dave I'll just say to you, Dave, you're one of the kindest men I have met in the context of this complicated world and this complicated field in terms of your inability to live out both the gospel and a thoughtful, in some sense of the word, a scientifically complex understanding of the human soul. So we'll get into the category of research. And the reason we want you listening is we live in a world right now where there is so much antipathy toward the so-called elitism of science, a kind of almost throw the sucker out because it complicates our life. Let's just get back to the simplicity of the gospel. When the richness of research actually gives us so much more acuity to reading the glory of God. So we want you to have a feel for how these unique people work, think, how they got into the field, but also we'll talk a little bit about what they've discovered about the Allender Center. But I just want to start with, how did two remarkable human beings like you two get into the world of research?
Yeah. Dave, do you want to go first?
Sure thing. Well, I never set out to become a researcher, or even a psychologist for that matter. My first two vocations were actually in software engineering and in social work. And even to this day, I think fundamentally, I'm still a pastor first, a pastor at heart. And, early on, several decades ago, during my first stint as a college pastor, I unfortunately encountered a case of clergy sexual misconduct that just totally rocked my world. the community that I belong to, my faith. I know some people use the word deconstruction, and that's certainly descriptive of what I was going through. And part of the reason why it was so disorienting was because I had been taught a particular kind of theory of change when it came to the Christian life. I grew up in a fairly conservative evangelical, might you describe it as a fundamentalist, church. And I was taught that, all I needed to know was the word of God, and that alone was fully sufficient for everything related to life and godliness. And here I was confronted with this real life embodied circumstance where we had people who knew the word of God quite well, and they were capable of doing horrible things and justifying it, using the word of God. And early on in my faith formation, that experience, bearing witness to that, it planted this seed in my heart, which turned out to be a research question that I carried to this day. And that research question is, well, how do people change for the better or for the worse? And, what processes do people follow? What are the means by which people, become formed into the likeness of God, and the likeness of Christ? And, how do people heal and recover from, emotional wounds, right? So this long journey led me into seminary. It led me into studying psychology, led me to doing trauma therapy, and it's really anchored almost all of the work that I do up until this day.
Thank you. And I think it's so true for most of us. There was something of heartache that brought us into the kind of questions that don't seem often to be invited to be thought about as a process in exploration versus simply an answer to be imbibed and therefore done. So I have been the recipient of, and we have been the recipient of, your kind curiosity. Danielle.
And, Dan and I have had the unique privilege of being able to hear you give a sermon as well. And that was a fantastic sermon. So just to say, we've been able to play with you in both fields. For me, I initially wanted to be a clinician. I kind of knew that psychology was my path pretty early on. And all of the topics that excited me the most in undergrad were classes like abnormal psychology or psychobiology of women. And I remember a friend telling me that if I wanted to be a competitive applicant for graduate school, I would need to get involved in a research laboratory and have some of that experience on my resume. And so I did in undergrad. I joined a cognition laboratory because I really liked the professor, and I did pretty well. By the time I graduated, I got a first author publication, and I even got a department scholar of the year. And so I think, given that, it's important to tell this side of the story too. I was inspired a couple years ago by Professor Johannes Haushofer, who's now at Cornell, who famously published his CV of failures, if you've ever read this. And, with these successes, and Dan so beautifully, alluded to all of these career successes and noteworthy achievements and things like that. And I want to just, also include, I applied to 8 clinical PhD programs out of undergrad and got into exactly none of them. And I had to take a year to figure out what to even do with my life. And it was such a humbling and tough year in so many ways. And, when someone has a PhD degree or some other successes career-wise, I think it starts to look like everything must have come easily for them along the way. But I share that part of my story because I think the failures of others are often invisible, whereas the successes are much more visible. So hear me when I say I haven't been an A+ student the whole way. But yeah, when I was deep in the work of trying to find out what my next step could be, I felt inspired to seek adventure abroad. I had some friends that did graduate school overseas, and I got accepted into my master's program, and I had a lot of curiosity about the mind-body connection from some of my classes and my own yoga practice at the time, and it seemed like a really good fit to study health psychology. And from there, I graduated and began my doctoral studies at the University of Liverpool, where I focused on addiction, eating behavior, and weight loss surgery outcomes. And even though doing research studies is often challenging and involves a lot of project management skills and problem solving, I really loved the work because I was able to work so directly with patients and people with lived experiences and to hear their perspectives. And being able to shed light on their underrepresented perspectives and experiences in my work was so valuable to me. And it remains a huge part of what keeps me connected to this work. And the full circle moment that I'm so excited to share is that, when I was living in the UK, I started actually listening to your podcast. This was like in 2016. And it was what ultimately brought me to the Allender Center. I thought to myself, if ever a job opens up there, I'm going to apply no matter what it is. And I would walk each day from my flat to the university and hear you both dialogue about topics that just inspired such hope and, inspiration in my heart. And it's wild to me to actually be recording with you today.
Oh, I'm not going to cry, but I feel it. It's such a sweet gift to think about you walking and listening and playing such a crucial role for us. I think in some ways you're opening up realms to the future that we, as those who created this institution, would never have had the vision, skills, or capacity to take us. And so before we jump in, I just need, as we talk about the research that you have begun with the Allender Center, can you do on my behalf, and perhaps our listeners, the difference between quantitative and qualitative research?
Sure. So, I'm not a qualitative researcher, but my understanding of the differences between quantitative and qualitative is that quantitative research tends to be based out of data that we collect from larger samples. This could be survey data, this can be, biological markers, behaviors, stuff that we can quantify and stuff that we can count. And quantitative research, statistical approaches to analyze this data. It's about finding trends and patterns within these larger sets of data, so we can extrapolate again trends and patterns within a large set of people. The qualitative research tends to be more centered not on quantifiable data, but rather through interviews and getting into people's embodied life experiences. And the goal of qualitative research is not so much to look at these larger patterns, because these larger patterns oftentimes will miss the particularities of an individual's experience. So qualitative research is wonderful at getting into those particularities, because that really brings out a lot of the richness of what people actually go through.
And am I right to say, Danielle, that's the work that you have done, something of that qualitative? And why should that matter to our listeners?
Yeah, we've done largely qualitative studies. We do have one quantitative study that's going to be a couple years in the making, just because with these kind of more numbers-based studies, you do need enough responses to start making some observations about trends and being able to generalize them. So that'll be a few years in the making. But yes, we've sat with people who've completed the story workshop. We've sat with people who've gone through our NFTC level 1 training, and we've asked them questions about their experience. And, for like why this is relevant to our folks listening, I know folks listening to the podcast come from all sorts of, cities, states, countries. They're part of different communities, and they have vocations from probably just about every field. But one thing that brings us together is the deep desire to care for our own stories and the stories of others with kindness and integrity. And research helps us to identify what kind of care is actually helpful, right? By designing studies that help us dive into the experiences of people who have been cared for. If we systematically explore insights that they share, we can adopt strategies and interventions that are supported by actual data. And stories are important, obviously. If you're listening to this podcast, you know that's true. But relying solely on intuition or anecdote can only take you so far.
Oh, it's so important. I almost want you to go through that again, but I won't. But to capture the importance of that, what you're saying is y'all have been faithful with what you've seen. You've been faithful at some level, anecdotally, to the process of what seems to be central for people's transformation. But what you're doing is, in some sense, going below the surface anecdote and starting to look at what are the root structures, what are the primary core nutrients that will help this beautiful plant grow even better. So, in that sense, this is an agricultural process, amendments being put in and clarity as to, now it's a little too much nitrogen. You might want a little bit more of something else. So that's crucial. You're helping us refine goodness.
Yeah. And I know, Dave, things that we've also talked about is like, I would love to hear a little bit more about this, but it also provides a level of accountability that is a part of supporting the work and refining the work. Was there more you would say about that?
That's right. And I think doing research and collecting data is one way to verify that something works. And we don't have to just trust someone's opinion on this. We can also have a more or less neutral third party make observations and verify that it works. And it also opens up, as we talked about just now, the opportunity to explore and examine why something works. And I think of many instances when I'm working with clients in my therapy practice where, I think I just landed this bomb, that just changed people for the better, and then we look back and we ask them, well, why did our time together facilitate healing? It had nothing to do with what I thought it actually contributed to. Is totally something else. And research is a way for us to discover that kind of thing too, because sometimes we as facilitators, we have an idea of what might be going on, but we don't actually know what's going on until we ask the person who's in that process.
It's really, at one level, very humbling.
It's very humbling.
It's like, oh, can we just go with my theory? And again, not to undermine, theory creates a context for exploration, but exploration not only illumines, therefore refines, but I love what you said, Rachael, it also provides an accountability that we can then grow what we're attempting to do. So what have you found so far with the work that you have done? I mean, again, we're at the beginning stages, but you both have done so much work already. And again, I know there's more, but I'd love to hear and love for people to hear what things have you begun to see and discover?
Yeah, and there's more discovery ahead. Dave and I are currently charting the course for our next steps. But, so far we've researched the story workshop. There was an event that happened in August 2024. And we're currently taking interviews and collecting survey responses for another study focused on the level 1 training experience. And so, we're in the middle of it. We're in the messy middle. There's lots of ideas. We're exploring themes. We're looking at the relationships between the themes. And so what I'll share today are some, kind of preliminary key takeaways we found from spending time with this data. These are emerging themes. They might not necessarily translate to what we'll ultimately include in the paper, but I'd love to just kind of share our top line summary, as it were. So focusing on the story workshop experience, the small group is a key part of the experience. So this event brings together a group of people that come together in a small group to tell a story of something that hurt them and to have that story engaged by their facilitators and by their group members. And in this group, people are coming together to witness one another and to offer their insights and also to feel understood and heard in their own story. And there are some key things that happen in that small group that we've learned about from sitting with these folks who participated in our study. So one of them is that the facilitator creates a safe space. And a key part of that is that they begin the time by reading their own story. And we've had people describe their experience of this as, when someone lets their armor down first, it allows you to feel safe. And it helps put the other group members at ease, showing them what they can expect when it comes time for them to read their story. And another part of creating the safety of that space is that the facilitator offers care for the storyteller in their story. They are for you. They're participating in this event because they are for you. They want to get into your story and to be present with you. And importantly, as a facilitator, they also create the containment for the group. They give parameters, they give guidelines, and they use their skill set to make sure everyone is heard and has enough time with sharing their story. And they guide the people in the group about how to engage and give feedback so the group can stay on track to engage one another in a curious, respectful, and kind way. So that's part of creating the safe space that the facilitator is, largely responsible for. Another kind of key takeaway that we've seen in the data is, the witnessing that happens in a small group is impactful as well. This is people hearing your story and you hearing other people's stories. And several people have shared with me that in feeling compassion and care so easily for others' stories, it becomes obvious that it's harder to access that same care for their own story. And that invites the opportunity to grow more self-compassionate. And another theme, I've only got a couple more. There's a lot I can share, but a couple more. Another key takeaway is connection. When people are listening, grieving with you, becoming angry on your behalf, some folks in the study shared that they felt less alone in their story.
Yeah.
Seeing people get angry on your behalf and helps you to make sense of what happened much more than someone telling you like, oh, it wasn't your fault, or I'm so sorry. And these people in your group are willing to step into your story with you and grieve with you. And most of the people I spoke with said they felt seen and connected to the other members of their group. Sometimes people had similar stories, and sometimes they were from completely different ages, different genders, belonging to different communities. And, when you get a group of people together, you're going to have all sorts of dynamics because people are complicated, messy human beings, right?
Yeah.
But with the facilitator creating that containment, people are able to get through moments where maybe they were misunderstood and move towards repair and restoring connection with one another. And just thinking about like how often that exact skill is modeled or even experienced, like moving through that repair and restoration, that can sometimes be, something that people don't experience very often in other parts of their lives, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And that relational trust, it builds relational trust. It's so important when sharing your stories. And the last kind of takeaway, I know we could go so many places with all these topics. The last kind of key takeaway I'll share, and we can interact with it, is vulnerability. Like, we know that connection isn't possible without some degree of vulnerability. And this is one of the most integrated parts of the story workshop experience from what I've been able to observe. Like teachers such as yourselves, Rachael and Dan, and Wendell is another teacher at the story workshop. You all share stories of things that that have happened in your own lives as you're introducing the people attending the event to concepts and frameworks. And the facilitator, as I said before, begins the group time with a vulnerable offering of their own story with the group. And then this, together with hearing other stories in the group, this gives courage to many of the people I spoke with to be vulnerable themselves. And what happens is the group gets a chance to be a safe place, to be honest, authentic, and gives people a chance to be seen for who they really are.
Again, that's such sweet news. It's what we would hope for, but again, to have something of the clarification of how those elements work. Dave, I'm curious as to what you hear in all that Danielle just put words to.
Yeah, how I make sense of all the rich results that Danielle just mentioned is that perhaps on a meta level, what's healing about these workshops is that they help us learn how to be in better touch with our own humanity,
Mhm. Yeah.
as well as the humanity, of others.
Mm.
My favorite definition of a trauma comes from Robert Stollerow, and he says that trauma is what happens when intense emotional pain cannot find a relational home in which it can be held. And and for these story workshops to provide that context where someone's story can be held not just by one individual therapist, but by a whole group of other people who have experienced profound hurt as well. And it's about providing that scaffolding to help people uh, build capacity to bear witness to somebody else's story, to bear witness to somebody else's pain. And eventually this gets internalized in the form of self-compassion and, other rich, constructs. But, ultimately we learn how to hold our own story, because I think if we're honest with ourselves, most of us, the way we talk to ourselves, we're kind of an ass, to ourselves. And when we have that embodied experience where I share my story and the people around us don't act like an ass, and we start realizing, oh, maybe that means that I can be human too, and, among, speaking more as a pastor, what I've seen among a lot of religious communities is that we tend to we don't bear witness. Instead, we analyze, we make judgments, we over spiritualize, we explain, we fix. We do anything but bear witness and hold pain. So this is this is stuff that we never had a chance to learn how to do, and it's never too late.
Never. Well, and Dave, over several conversations, one January or so ago, when you joined us to do some of the work of forming and thinking about how to move in this, you brought up some of the work you have done in other places on ambiguity. And what you've discovered there, I think, has a lot to do with how we hold our own and other people's suffering. We want often a kind of black and white world. This is right, this is wrong, but there's much gray. And I'd love for you to put words to that. And then Danielle, love for you if there's other categories you've seen with regard to how we hold ambiguity, where that takes you.
Yeah, sure thing. So we published a few empirical studies from quantitative, data and quantitative analysis. A lot of my research focuses not only on trauma, but on spiritual formation and spiritual maturity. And, questions like, well, what are those ingredients that actually cultivate spiritual maturity over time? And we discovered that one unexpected ingredient is this notion of ambiguity tolerance. This was, at least within the psychological literature, the closest thing we can find to holding the mystery of Christ, holding the mystery of the embodied, life. And we find that there's something about having a capacity to just not know. And we're probably still not going to like it, but we're not going to go we're not going to spiral, downhill because of it, but we can hold it, we can tolerate it. And there's something about that embodied capacity that actually is directly and indirectly tied to spiritual maturity and Christ-likeness. So some of the really fun findings that are possible through quantitative research.
I don't want to take us off track because Danielle, I want to make space for you. But what that makes me think of is in my undergrad, probably my oldest and wisest professor. I think he was 75. He was delaying retirement because he loved teaching so much. He was my Greek professor, Dr. Roark. He had us in Greek class. We were looking at the passage in Hebrews that talks about losing your salvation, which for Southern Baptists was what? And I remember he showed us the 15 different ways you could make meaning of that. And we were waiting because it was well, he's going to tell us the right one. He's going to tell us which one we're supposed to believe, right? Because our whole spiritual formation was really this is how and what you believe. And this is how and what you belong. And I remember this day so specifically because he was we were all right, Dr. Roark, what's the right answer? And he was I don't know. And I remember like looking around the classroom at all these 19-year-olds, we were all like gasping, and it was kind of like, oh, he's lying. This is a joke. Like, he's going to bring it. And him just saying, so much of our faith is holding things in tension, that like the very attempt to try to resolve the tension actually, like, the whole thing falls. And ultimately, there's probably a way that these truths, the way people are interpreting need to come together. So he said, what do? I stand firm on the promises of God, that like there's nothing that can separate me from the love of God. But I take seriously and heed the warning that like, there are ways I trouble the spirit to the point of like possible separation, and it's like, there was something about that moment that's always stayed with me. And I absolutely believe story work has invited me to hold that tension in my own story, in those places where I want to come to a kind of resolve that makes, I can find a kind of meaning and truth, that I can stand on. And I have found like so much of not only emotional maturity, but spiritual maturity has been coming to the places where I have a greater capacity to bear attention. And we see this even when Paul uses this language of like, in community, rejoice with those who rejoice and grieve with those who grieve. And I have found that to be one of the most challenging complexities and ambiguity of being an adult, right? Like you come into adulthood and you just keep waiting for that season when all the people you love will, or in a church community, everyone will kind of just be in a season of rejoicing together or be in a season of mourning together, and how to hold these places of tension. So as someone who doesn't often get as much access to the research, ambiguity tolerance is something I'm going to take with me and hold on to.
And Danielle, what have you discovered about that or other domains about what's required for the human heart to grow?
Yeah, so it's interesting we talk about ambiguity tolerance, and that would be something that we might identify kind of later on in the analysis. Right now, we're in kind of the looking at things in very, very detailed type phase. But I love what you're describing about how when you're introduced a concept, you get some insight. You can identify where it's active in your life. You can identify where that's a movement your own heart needs to make. And just having these concepts and getting this language can sometimes be the light bulb moment that you need to take the next step in your story. And that ties into what we are learning from this study is that, people find the teaching time to be insightful, especially where new ideas are introduced. And quite a few folks who attended the story workshop were already familiar with some of the concepts because they might have listened to the podcast, they might have attended a workshop, they might have read your book, Stan, or engaged with some of our online offerings or what have you. There might be some degree of familiarity, but, being at the workshop and having this language, like when you talk about vows or agreements, that was particularly impactful for people. But just in general, being able to have language for naming the unknown grips that particular events and parts of story have had on one's life. And doing it in a theologically rich space. The connections to scripture and the story of God were helpful for several people I spoke to as well, with one person describing their experiences now being able to look at Bible verses in a new way. And that ties to like insight, right? And, we've talked about the small group experience so far, and together with the teaching times, all these experiences help people who attended the story workshop to gain some insight into their own story. People described it as getting a new sense of clarity, particularly after the second time their story was engaged. And that second story engagement is really important because in these groups, you have one round of everybody reading their story out loud and having that story engaged with. And then that same story is shared again. And that second engagement allows people to go deeper, to pull out more from the words that were shared and gain a greater understanding of what happened and how it impacted them. That insight, one person described it as having a light bulb moment when that second engagement was happening. And another person described it as surprising, but profoundly powerful.
Yeah.
And, I think it's really helpful to describe what people took away from that experience. And kind of tying it back to the wider literature, thinking about the theological richness of that event, integrating faith when teaching about concepts in the psychological world is an approach that does have support in the wider literature. So we got to locate what we're doing within the field as well and research into other forms of teaching. It's called psychoeducation in some spaces, such as cognitive behavioral therapy. If you're a therapist, you're kind of teaching your client about CBT. Research into other forms like that offer that faith-adapted psychotherapy protocols can be just as or even more effective than the usual CBT protocols. These are supported by studies by Lim et al. 2014 study and Anderson et al. 2015 study. So it's great to see that, when we're taking faith into this teaching space where we're introducing people into new concepts that are, grounded in the psychology literature, it's additive or at least just as effective.
Well, and it's in one sense, it gives grounding to enter into the place where there isn't grounding.
Yeah.
In one sense, you've got a foundation to enter into the water, and there is ambiguity, but there's also clarity, and to be able to hold to both, not to, in one sense, obscure clarity because you're just full of nothing but doubt. On the other hand, those who have faith, but still will not enter into the reality that we all struggle with, that question of, is God good? So that, I love that. I love what you have put words to, Danielle, in terms of there is insight and clarity, but also the realm to be able to allow that to migrate into the deeper questions that we often are not, shall we say, allowed or honored for asking. So before we end, I just want to hear, because to me it's so exciting. Like, where's this taking us? Where's it going to go? When are we going to arrive?
For me personally, I feel inspired by the movement of taking healing from the individual into the collective. And this is something we talk about in our training programs. The importance, of course, of pursuing your own healing, but also tuning into the sense of calling that people feel towards engaging and caring for others' stories. We're not just in this work towards an individual model of healing, but rather in a communal, all of creation model of healing. And that's one of the ways that I understand the kingdom of heaven being both in the now and the not yet. Individual healing to me feels like the now, where there are changes we experience in our personal lives, where we grow, we forgive, we practice a little more self-compassion. And the not yet is where these personal transformations start to move outward and contribute to the broader collective healing.
I love that.
Moving towards wholeness means engaging with others, healing communal wounds, and working towards justice and unity. And together, this individual and collective healing are something we can experience and co-create in part today, while anticipating a fuller, more complete realization in the future.
Sweet. Oh, and David, as one who's, shall we say, you have more than dabbled your toes in our world, but nonetheless, you swim in a lot of worlds. What do you see with regard to the Allender Center and what this research is taking us to?
Yeah, there is quite a lot of research that looks into, religion and emotional well-being, religion and healing, and I think what it's this vast literature is pointing to is that religion can be both helpful as well as not so helpful, and in some cases harmful, towards one's kind of healing journey. And so for me, I feel like the fruit of this research is more of pursuing a reconstructive vision, right? So it's one thing for me to deconstruct and critique and go, these are the unhelpful ways that Christians or faith is brought in, and but then I think the more important and more difficult question to answer is, well, without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I mean, how can we lean on our faith in ways that are helpful, that doesn't re-traumatize, but actually supports recovery and thriving. And how do we, as Danielle mentioned earlier, how do we do this not just individually, but collectively as well?
Before we end, let me just see if I can name it in this way. You both have eyes, a taste, a sensitivity to the particular. Is that not true? You enter into the complexity of reality and what reality brings. Is that honoring and accurate?
Aspirational. I really hope so.
Yeah. Well, but I think so more so than I do. But what I'd also say is that both of you, in that kind of deep entry into the particularity of reality, also have a capacity to synthesize, to hold things in their like the complexity, but yet the synthesis into the whole. True?
Yeah.
It's a remarkable interplay. It's what I think good therapy does. It's also what remarkable research does. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you again for joining us. We hope that the conversations we share with you here on the Allender Center podcast have touched your heart and sparked a sense of hope within you. Our work at the Allender Center is fueled by the support of people like you. As a nonprofit organization housed within the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, our mission is to boldly engage the impact of trauma and abuse on the human heart and to provide hope and healing to individuals, families, and communities. Your contributions directly contribute to making this vision a reality. If you feel moved to join us in this work, we invite you to consider making a one-time or monthly gift. Your donation, no matter the size, plays a significant role in bringing the hope of redemption and healing to so many. To give, simply visit theallendercenter.org/give. Once again, we extend our heartfelt gratitude for your support. Together, we can continue to bring hope and healing to those who need it. Thank you.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.